From his humble beginnings as a laconic background character to his rise as the titular character of his own show, Boba Fett has, perhaps more than any other character in the Star Wars universe, amassed a rabid cult following of fans. The fancy armor, the Clint Eastwood-like attitude, Fett emits an aura of bravado and cool that's rare in a character from any film, let alone one in an almost 45-year-old franchise. And the thing that makes him so interesting is that we still have so much to learn about him. It's then no wonder that when the time came for Disney to take over the Star Wars brand and its subsequent characters, Boba Fett stood out as someone deserving of a place in a slate of new projects. Hey everybody, my name's Hunter, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the Disney Plus series, The Book of Boba Fett, knowing full well that what I have to say will more than likely ruffle some feathers. Whether you know it or not, Star Wars fans are very opinionated, me being one of them. That being said, rather than simply going into detail about how lame I thought the show was, which doesn't serve as anything other than noise, I wanted to take a look at one aspect of the show that I found the most distressing: the ignorance of continuity and the effect it has on the overall narrative. As is the case with all of my videos, my goal here is to take what I've learned from studying the Book of Boba Fett and then apply that to my own storytelling in future projects, whether it be in comics or in film. And hopefully you're able to do that too. So without further ado, let's get into it. Before we get down to the nitty-gritty, it's important to have some parameters when it comes to analyzing the continuity of the Star Wars cinematic universe as it relates to the Book of Boba Fett. Although it may be controversial, I believe we really can only use the films of the first two trilogies and The Mandalorian before looking at Boba Fett's appearance in the Book of Boba Fett. Don't get me wrong, I love me some Star Wars content of all kinds. However, while it is canon, the more apocryphal works like the comics or Clone Wars only serve to enhance the world of Star Wars. That is to say, you don't need to have read, watched, or heard them in order to understand the movie, or in this case the show, you're watching. Whether it's the Darth Vader comic or Rebels, this content is more of an icing on the cake. By having the icing with the cake, you definitely get a more delicious eating experience. But really, the cake is what binds everything together, and as such, is the main block for which everything else is built upon. To be completely honest with you, when I started writing this video, talking about continuity in the Star Wars universe was definitely not what I had in mind. To me, it's a topic that tends to be more alienating and hyperbolic than anything else, and it doesn't usually lend itself to critical analysis. However, as I watched The Mandalorian, a show I found to be filled with subtle continuity issues, it wasn't until I watched The Book of Boba Fett that I began to feel that this issue of continuity was a topic with a little bit more meat to it, especially when it comes to The Book of Boba Fett. The whole notion of the past in the Disney-era Star Wars cinematic universe is a pretty dicey subject. Let's not forget that we've seen what happens when someone openly and very obviously disregards the continuity of the Star Wars cinematic universe, like in Rian Johnson's The Last Jedi. Although I personally love the film for its bold, though at times gimmicky choices, the filmmaker was put in the unenviable position of being seen as the bad guy for looking at the continuity he was left with and deciding to go in a different direction. I do understand why this choice was made, too. When you don't acknowledge the past continuity, you aren't beholden to 45 plus years of mythos. You're theoretically able to start fresh, with a sort of clean slate. But at the same time, you're also opening yourself up to causing a lot more narrative problems than you are resolving them, due to this omission and alteration, which is something we'll talk about in a little bit. From a viewer perspective, things can also just sort of go unresolved, or ideas previously presented can get jumbled.
Ray, I never told you when!
Leaving the viewer even more confused. All that being said, if at the end of the day you're trying to establish a new paradigm for your franchise, which it certainly seems Disney is, odds are this sort of thing probably isn't a worry for you, so long as it remains profitable. You have to be careful though, because if you're not paying attention, the alteration of continuity can sweep the narrative structure of your whole universe out from underneath you, and thus alienate the viewer even more, which it seemingly has for me. Moving on, we also have to understand the importance of Jon Favreau's role within the Book of Boba Fett. A very accomplished filmmaker in his own right, Favreau is perhaps most known for his contributions to the MCU, aka the Marvel Cinematic Universe. He's also been pioneering a lot of technological advances in the filmmaking world. And when you think about technology, filmmaking, and franchise creation, they all meet in the center, Venn diagram style, at Star Wars. Disney no doubt knows this and this may very well have given Favreau an edge in terms of being chosen as the creative lead for The Mandalorian and subsequently the Book of Boba Fett. It also probably didn't hurt that, even though it doesn't really play into what we're talking about today, Favreau has played in the Star Wars sandbox before, being involved with the Clone Wars animated series. And going further, it's fairly safe to assume that both him and Disney, wanting to move the Star Wars brand in a new direction, and yet also not Rian Johnson themselves, had decided the best way to move forward would be to play it safe by employing this subtle ignorance and alteration of the existing continuity. And like I mentioned earlier, in essence, this choice allows Favreau to, in the case of Boba Fett, create a newer version of the character, free from the creative bondage that the Lucas continuity brings, and even create a newer version of the Star Wars universe at large. Still, as someone who has worked within the confines of an existing universe before, we would think that Jon Favreau and his team must have a pretty strong understanding of the importance of Star Wars continuity, and the importance of continuity in general as it relates to franchise films. But after watching the show, this sort of doesn't seem to be the case. With the Book of Boba Fett, Favreau and his team use some very sly tactics in order to ensure that audiences don't focus on what the creative team isn't acknowledging. The most noteworthy of these methods is a measure they most likely picked up from Favreau and his time with another iconic brand, Marvel, thus inextricably cementing Favreau's significance to the series. See, one of the key components of the Marvel films is what I'd call Marvel moments. These are typically scenes where the fans who have seen all the films and/or read the comics, the real diehards, get rewarded with a tease or Easter egg at the larger universe at play. For example, Ronan the Accuser in Captain Marvel, Tobey Maguire in Spider-Man No Way Home, and Vision's Infinity Stone in Age of Ultron. The long and short of it is that it's a sort of wink-wink, nudge-nudge, and it results in a memorable moment for the audience, while also giving that diehard fan a sort of one-up on things to come within the franchise. Marvel moments also tend to be the moment that you remember from the film, sometimes even more than the plot of the movie. These moments can also leave the fan with a potentially good feeling about the film or show they just watched, even if they really didn't enjoy it overall. Perhaps the most important aspect of the Marvel moments, though, is that they deeply revolve around maintaining the existing continuity within the Marvel films. They also give the audience a reason to go back through the entire Marvel catalog with a closer, more watchful eye. Because if they do, they stand to have a more full understanding of the MCU than the average viewer does. And in a sense, they're forcing the viewer to do a reread. So when taking the same tactic that Marvel employs and applying it to the Star Wars cinematic universe, Favreau and the team have ultimately failed because they seem to be picking and choosing the continuity from each episode, which hints at a misunderstanding about the usage of the Marvel moment despite their familiarity with it. Whereas Marvel rewards you with a fuller understanding of their universe for paying close attention, Favreau and team have, though at times pulled it off, unintentionally opened a can of worms by asking their Marvel-trained viewer to be hyper-aware of the small details throughout the show. And by changing what has come before it, not embracing it, these small details ultimately knock the narrative structure out from the Book of Boba Fett. This may seem a little bit far-fetched, especially to the casual Star Wars viewer. So why don't we take a look at a few scenes from the flagship films and follow them through to scenes from the Book of Boba Fett. In my mind, one of the most important moments of change to take a look at is from Return of the Jedi, with this scene, the Sarlacc pit and Skiff explosion. At first, it might not seem like a scene that really has anything other than setting up that Boba falls into the Sarlacc pit and shows us that Jabba dies and explodes into a million pieces. But that's where you would be wrong. Without going into too much exposition regarding this scene, Luke has come to save Leia and Han, who are currently a prisoner of Jabba. Jabba wants to send a message that insubordination won't be tolerated, and as such, he transports his royal court, including Bib Fortuna, out to the Sarlacc pits in the desert. Keep in mind there is no Imperial, meaning Stormtrooper presence in this scene. It's just outlaws and one gutsy Jedi in training. With that in mind, right at the start of the Book of Boba Fett, we're met with a contradiction. Back in Return of the Jedi, Bib Fortuna is seen on Jabba's skiff prior to the explosion. This implies he's probably died along with everyone on board when that happens. And yet, at the end of The Mandalorian Season 2, we have this scene, which sets up the whole premise for the Book of Boba Fett. However, if we believe that moment from Return of the Jedi is truth, the reality that the Book of Boba Fett has set up doesn't line up, does it? Sure, there's an argument to be made that Bib got away on one of the other vehicles, but that has problems as well. At the beginning of the scene from Return of the Jedi, we see that there are in fact 2 additional hovercraft beside the main skiff, one being the craft that Luke and the gang end up escaping on. That other craft, though, ultimately gets destroyed, or at least becomes seemingly inoperable when this moment happens. That would imply that even if Bib Fortuna escaped this, he wouldn't be able to get anywhere. This then begs the question, if Bib Fortuna doesn't escape and we assume dies in the desert, how does this scene with Boba even happen? If that scene doesn't happen because Bib Fortuna doesn't take over for Jabba, Boba is fighting for control of an organization that theoretically wouldn't exist. And that means no show, no plot, nothing. This problem is also twofold, in that because Favreau has chosen to use Bib Fortuna here, setting up a Marvel moment for viewers familiar with the character's role in previous films, we're actively being told we should go revisit Return of the Jedi to acquaint ourselves with Bib. But when we do, we very clearly see that Bib cannot be a part of the Book of Boba Fett because, yep, you guessed it, this. At this point, I can almost certainly guarantee that you're rolling your eyes saying, oh come on, that's stupid. That's just one small tiny little detail, you nerd. Another moment from the same scene results in almost the same level of implication, even if it is a little bit nitpicky. How did this guy, who is in what seems to be about the same level of degradation that Boba Fett is in, get here? It may not seem like much, but I mentioned the degradation thing because based on the deterioration of the Stormtrooper armor being at a similar point as Boba Fett's, we can assume they were thrown or had fallen into the pit at roughly the same time. Following this line of thought, are we then supposed to believe that just before this explosion on the skiff happened, that a Stormtrooper conveniently fell into the pit? Sure, it doesn't seem like that much of a big deal for fabrication, and as a Marvel moment in the show, the inclusion of the Stormtrooper is really a reference to the other films that will probably make the viewer say, "Wow, cool!" The thing is, when you think about it for a moment, if the Stormtrooper isn't there, we don't get this moment. Which means we don't get this moment. Which means we don't get this moment. Which ultimately means we may not get this moment. And of course I'm being a little over the top here, but you get the idea. Without that small alteration of what we know from Return of the Jedi, the Book of Boba Fett as a show veritably can't happen. The entire premise is gone as it's all essentially predicated on the Stormtrooper's placement in the pit. And furthermore, by including this scene in the Book of Boba Fett, rather than leave it to the viewer's imagination to figure out how Boba got out of the pit, we as a viewer are again being asked to reference this moment in Return of the Jedi. And when we do, the alteration becomes more apparent, and thus undercuts the effectiveness of the Marvel moment. There's even the issue of Boba Fett's whole anger with Jabba that doesn't necessarily line up. At the start of the show, Boba feels somehow that Jabba is solely responsible for Boba ending up in the Sarlacc pit. Yet, we clearly see that in Return of the Jedi, Han Solo is the one who lands Boba in the pit. So why wouldn't he be going after Han Solo, or maybe Luke for that matter, since this whole fight scene happens thanks to Luke in this silly kick? There's a lot of this kind of thing throughout the whole length of the show, the more you pay attention to it. And I can go on, but ultimately what it all boils down to is that continuity comes from writing. And if the continuity isn't working, I really think the writing isn't working. From a writing perspective, an essential component to crafting a compelling narrative with pre-existing characters, as is the case with Boba Fett, is that we have to acknowledge or at least understand the full scope of the character's past within the overall story in order to show how that's resulted in the character's present. That is not to say that we have to see every single struggle that the character has ever experienced, but it's the writer's responsibility to be the gatekeeper on all things regarding the character. An example of this is the character of Darth Vader and Anakin. When George Lucas created the original Star Wars trilogy, he understood everything about who Darth Vader was, a majority of which we ended up seeing in the prequel trilogy with Anakin. When he handed off the story to legendary writers Lee Brackett and Lawrence Kasdan for Empire Strikes Back, I would like to assume that the writers studied Lucas's character work, taking the time to understand the fullness of Darth Vader and his past experiences in order to understand how he can function going forward in the story's present. Overall, it informs the writing and where and how the story moves. By not acknowledging this background information, or in our case, the continuity of previous films, can we then even say that the story we're now watching is a part of the franchise in which it claims to be? I would venture to say that in the context of the Book of Boba Fett, although it takes place in the Star Wars universe and has Star Wars characters, because of its cherry picking of continuity, It should just be considered a new sci-fi show with some interesting space stuff. Because in my mind, if you're going to use the continuity, you have to use all of it. When it's taken out of context, it becomes, like we see here, extremely problematic. Wrapping everything up, I think the big takeaway for me today is how important the little details are when it comes to my writing. Even though a minor moment may be inconsequential to me at the time, if down the road I spin the narrative in a way that goes against what I've already set up, the story's structural integrity is at risk with every passing scene. Furthermore, by being aware of the importance of what has come before in the narrative, I can have more control over what can be used as foreshadowing in the narrative and thus give the audience a reason to revisit the work again in order to yield an even more rewarding feeling upon finishing the comic, film, video, or whatever it is. Thanks so much for checking this video out. I like to talk, a lot. You know, in grade school when they write talks excessively in class on your report card? That was me, especially when it came to Star Wars. And as an adult, that is no different. So props to you for sitting through me talking excessively about something that I already talked excessively about. With that being said, I know a lot of people have a lot of different thoughts on the Book of Boba Fett, and I want to hear them. So if you like what I have to say, if you don't, or if you have questions, let me know by commenting below. And if you feel really generous, subscribing would be really nice too. Also, my wife is the best, and she helped me edit this video, so give her a thumbs up at least. Anyway, I have to get back to work on my next video, but you can bet your bottom dollar that I will see you down the road soon. Bye.